Hello, everybody, and welcome to this lecture series on presentation skills and pitching your practice. So, I know that presentation skills are probably one of the most intimidating areas of study and practice that you have to be comfortable with when running a business. And so, what we're going to be doing over the next few slides is looking at some of the key presentation skills that you need to have in mind when pitching your practice or your organization, whether it be for funding purposes or whether it be for partnering purposes, for joining in on joint ventures, and just the essential skills that you need to have in place when talking about your business or your organization. That's what we'll be looking at over the next three sets of slides, starting with some overall presentation skills, and then moving over into your organizational specific content that you need to have in place when talking about your organization. We have met before, and just a brief background as to who I am. Chartered accountant by profession, spent the better part of 8 years in academics as a senior lecturer at the University of Johannesburg, specializing in accounting and corporate governance. I'm now the founder and CEO of an academy, which is a skills development organization and consultancy for small businesses. I also completed my MBA at Oxford University in the UK before returning back to South Africa. All right, so this module is going to be broken down into three lecture series. The first, which is this one, centers around the structure of a good presentation. So we're going to be looking at some generic concepts that need to be adhered to or taken seriously in order to structure a good presentation. And there are a number of key elements that you need to consider in somewhat of a framework, which then you can use to populate into a solid presentation that is not only impactful but also allows you to achieve your goal of obtaining funding or entering into a partnership or whatever the objective of your presentation is. We're then going to move over into the second set of lectures, which is covering all of your bases when pitching your practice organization. So there's certain things that an investor or a donor within the context of NPOs need to understand and need to be aware of, which is your job to make them sort of aware of these things and to also answer their questions and to provide a compelling argument for them to engage with you further, whether it be in the form of donations, whether it be in the form of funding or investment, or whether it be in the form of in a more informal sense of referring you to other partners who could be useful in achieving your goals and objectives. And so that's going to be split into the remaining two portions because there's quite a bit of content to cover. And that's what we're going to be doing in the next lecture slides, along with the last set of slides, which will be coming up later on. All right, so we're going to start off with looking at a useful framework that you can use to prepare for your presentation that will be coming up. And the framework that we use is what we refer to as the PEACE method. And each letter is, of course, serves as a guide for you to develop an important element of the presentation. And once you've got all of the elements together, you then have all of the necessary elements that enable you to deliver an impactful presentation. So let's start off with looking at the acronym as a whole, and then we can zone into the specifics in the remainder of the slides. So starting off with the P, you need to, of course, plan and plan with purpose. All right, so all of the planning that goes into your presentation needs to be aligned to a particular purpose. So a lot of the time, if you are not focused on what you need or on what you need to do in terms of setting out a clear purpose, a lot of the preparation and a lot of the time you spend ends up being wasted because it's not necessarily relevant to what you're trying to achieve. Or sometimes you veer off away from the center or the core of what you want to do with the presentation, and you find that you have to cut out a lot of things and replace it with additional elements that are more appropriate, which makes the process a little bit inefficient and wastes an unnecessary amount of time. So starting off, like anything that you hope to be successful, a fair amount of planning needs to take place, and we'll speak about that in a little bit more detail shortly. Once you enter into the presentation, we speak about the I, or the initiate, and we speak about initiating with the right hook. And essentially what we mean there is get your audience captured. So capture them immediately with something that catches that is interesting, that is engaging, that puts them in a position where they want to hear more. All right. So when we talk about the right hook, we speak about some sort of engagement that gets them to the point where they say, okay, let's listen to what this person has to say. And you then, are well positioned to deliver on your presentation, and you stand a far better chance of achieving your goal versus when the audience is kind of disengaged and you need to pick them up and pick their interest up later on in the presentation. So we'll speak about that also in a lot more detail. And then thirdly, we speak about the E for engage. And so we look at a number of techniques that you can use to engage with your audience. So looking at things like visual aids, looking at things like asking questions, having little votes, etc. These are all techniques that allow you to engage with your audience in such a way where you keep them interested and you keep them sort of in a position where they want to hear more, and they don't veer off or doze off away from exactly the message that you want them to receive. We look at the C in convene, and then we talk about, and that's where we talk about zoning into the purpose, where the main objective of what you want your audience to take away from the presentation is then achieved. And how do we convene our ideas and our message to get to the point where they know exactly what you are trying to achieve with the presentation. And of course, lastly, we speak about ending off with an action plan. And remember, all good presentations need to have a call to action. So how do you ensure that you have a call to action that your audience is then well prepared to then undertake? So let's talk about planning. So planning is really the first step of your presentation, and the P in plan can be easily replaced with the word so instead of using the word plan, the P could stand for purpose, and that's really the why. So we ask ourselves, why are we doing this presentation? What is the point of this presentation? And ideally, you should be able to reduce the purpose of your presentation to a single sentence. So if somebody asks you in a single sentence, why are you delivering this presentation? You should be able to answer them in one sentence, because it means you've clarified in your own mind what it is you're trying to achieve with this presentation. So whether it's to secure an additional meeting with investors, whether it's to secure investment itself, whether it's to secure donor funds, whether it is to build a relationship, whatever the objective is, in a single sentence you need to be able to articulate that, and that reflects on your the clarity attached to your presentation. Also, you could at a secondary level, it could be a much more subtle goal, and it could be things like to inform your audience of something. It could be to persuade them to take action in a certain way. It's to motivate them to take certain actions. It could be simply to entertain them. And so there are a number of reasons why you could be delivering this presentation, and in your mind, you need to be clear as to what you are trying to achieve, so that everything that you do in your preparation and in your planning centers around this purpose, and you don't veer off away from the main purpose of the presentation. So there are some important points that you should consider when planning. And number one is focus on your audience as you're defining the purpose. Your first step is to get an understanding of who your audience is. Are they directors? Are they employees? Are they investors? Are they decision makers? Are they the people you speak to before you get to the decision makers, etc.? So you need to understand with a very clear mind who it is you're going to be speaking to. And once you've got a sense of who you're speaking to, it then becomes a lot more easier to structure your presentation. The next thing is to understand the scope of your presentation, so the limitations. So things like timing, things like the type of format you're allowed to use, the type of visual aids you're allowed to use. So all of the limitations that enable you to scope your presentation, you need to be aware of. This could also be content related, so it's useful to reflect on this in the sense that you may want to speak about many different things, but by limiting the scope to the things that you actually speak about, it could actually be more useful than going down the path of perhaps giving them too much of information, with a lot of it that's not relevant or useful for the objective of the presentation. It's then important to reflect on the tone of your approach. So what sort of tone are you going to have? Is it a forceful tone? Is it an informal, relaxed tone? And that's a function of the audience that you're speaking to. So it's also useful to understand what is the culture within the organization. How do they typically communicate with each other? There are certain industries where there are certain norms. So for example, we're dealing in financial services, for instance. It's quite a formal, professional environment. But then when you're speaking within the context of a lot of tech companies, especially where you have younger founders and you have younger people at management and executive level, it sometimes becomes a little bit more informal in the way you communicate. So it just depends, and you need to sort of understand those nuances before you start writing out your script. And of course, that is step 4, where you need to actually write out your script. And a lot of the time, you may feel like, as long as I have my main points, I'll be able to wing it, sort of a thing. But I would definitely guard against that, especially when speaking to an audience for the first time. So you want to have a very well-written script. However, you don't need to necessarily stick to that script word by word. But by writing down all of your thoughts, it enables you to prepare your mindset for what's coming up. And so definitely writing your script is an important element of the preparation process. And then lastly, the most effective style of your presentation is something that needs to be considered. So definitely, I would apply my mind to the different types of visual aids that I could perhaps use. So whether it's a flip chart or whether it's a PowerPoint presentation, I would also consider the format of delivery. So sometimes it could be a formal presentation, sometimes it could be a very engaging two-way presentation where it's more discussive rather than a formal presentation per se. When speaking to a large audience, of course, establishing a more formal atmosphere is the way to go. However, when you're speaking to a smaller audience, sometimes focus groups or more informal focus could be the way to go. So the I for initiate speaks about grabbing your audience's attention, and what you're trying to do is, from the offset of your presentation, you want to capture your audience and you want to capture their attentions, and usually this is done with a clever opening line. It's sometimes done with an opening paragraph or an emotive story. So storytelling is also something very useful to consider, and at this juncture I would encourage you to do a little bit of reading around the technique of storytelling and what are the elements there. And you will find that in a lot of TED Talks, storytelling is a very central feature of many great presentations, and so that's a very good way of initiating a starting point from which to start engaging with your audience. Remember that when you are writing your script in the previous step, don't focus too much on the introduction, rather focus on the big picture and the entire presentation as a whole. The initiate step of the preparation process, which is the one that we're speaking about now, is where you'll then zone in on the specifics of what you want your introduction to be. And this is where I would then spend some time to understand what works, what doesn't work, bearing in mind who my audience is and what sort of culture emanates across the audience, so that the right opening line or the right opening story can be used to capture their attention. We then speak about engaging with the audience, and so engaging with the audience is a very subtle skill. And engagement with the audience doesn't necessarily mean getting them to verbally communicate back with you through the presentation. So you don't necessarily need to have a conversation with your audience in order to engage with them, but more subtle techniques may be used where, for instance, you ask a rhetorical question which they reflect on during the course of your presentation, or you request votes by a show of hands. Stimulating laughter gets them engaged into the presentation as well. Looking at some formal tools like a Q&A session at the end of the presentation is a way to get them engaged. And so by informing them that there will be this Q&A session at the end, throughout the presentation, they are listening more attentively because they are anticipating this opportunity to then clarify certain aspects of your talk or get further information on some of the points that you raise. Remember, visual aids can also play a very, very useful role. And so whether you're using a slideshow or a picture or a flip chart, where appropriate, this is also a very useful tool when delivering an engaging presentation. Convening refers to then taking all of your ideas, all of your points, your anecdotes, your stories, and reflecting on the overall content to make sure that it aligns to the purpose of the talk. And so moving away from the main purpose of your presentation is sometimes why presentations fail. And so when you write your script and when you consider all of the elements that go into delivering this presentation, make sure that everything you do aligns to this purpose. And your ideas, your opinions, your stories, your anecdotes, all of these relate directly to the purpose of the presentation. And so sometimes you are tempted to bring in a very interesting story or an interesting point or an interesting anecdote, which really doesn't contribute to the presentation as a whole. And in those instances, although it's kind of a tough decision to make, the right thing to do is to exclude those sort of stories or whatever it may be. If you feel that an activity or a question, for instance, may push you away from the objective, so by, for instance, asking a question that's going to open up a different can of worms, so to speak, anticipate the kind of response you would have from certain tools that you would anticipate using for audience engagement, and of course make the tough decision if need be. It will definitely pay off in the end. And then lastly, when we speak about the call to action, which is probably the most important part of the element, is that you want to leave your audience with some sort of call to action. So, we don't just want the audience to say, wow, that was a great presentation, or that was so entertaining, or that was really fun. But you want them to take a particular action. And so, whether it's you want them to set up a follow-up meeting, whether you want them to make a call on investing, whether you want them to connect you to somebody else, etc. Make sure that the call to action or the next steps after the presentation are clearly defined. And from there, you then have a point of departure on which to structure your next or your follow-up session with the organization. And so when we look at this method, the so-called PEACE method, it puts together a nice framework for you to then not only prepare your script, but also consider all of the other elements that are important to delivering a good presentation. And lastly, there is a video on YouTube that you can watch. It's titled 10 Secret to Great Public Speaking by Chris Anderson, and in there there's some very, very useful tips and techniques that you can consider. Remember that delivering a good presentation is something that is ever evolving, and you always want to be learning new tricks, new techniques, and through that you refine your ability to deliver a great presentation. And so with that, I'm going to conclude.